Hey there, folks. Clyde Chester here. And today I need to tell you about one of the strangest, most tragic disasters in American history. A disaster so bizarre that if you read about it in a novel, you'd say the author had lost their mind. I'm talking about January 15th, 1919, a Wednesday afternoon in Boston's North End, when a 50-foot wave of molasses came roaring down Commercial Street at 35 miles an hour, killing 21 people, injuring 150 more, and turning several city blocks into a sticky hell that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood, and I promise you, it's darker and stranger than you can possibly imagine. Now, before we get into the horror of that January day, we need to talk about molasses, because most Americans today don't really understand what molasses meant to this country in the early 20th century. We think of it as something Grandma used in her gingerbread cookies, right? But back in 1919, molasses was liquid gold. It was the key ingredient in producing industrial alcohol, which was used in everything from munitions to medicine. And with World War I having just ended a few months earlier, and with Prohibition looming on the horizon, the 18th Amendment had been ratified just a few days before our story begins, molasses was more valuable than ever. Companies were stockpiling it, knowing that once Prohibition kicked in, they'd need massive quantities to produce legal industrial alcohol. That's where the Purity Distilling Company comes in. They were owned by United States Industrial Alcohol, one of the biggest booze conglomerates in the country, and they'd built a massive storage tank right in the heart of Boston's North End. And when I say massive, I need you to really picture this thing. This tank was 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter. It held 2.5 million gallons of molasses when full. That's 26 million pounds of thick, sticky syrup. The tank was painted brown to blend in with the molasses inside, and it loomed over the neighborhood like some kind of industrial monstrosity, casting a shadow over the narrow streets and tenement buildings where Italian and Irish immigrant families lived, worked, and raised their children. The North End in 1919 was one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in America. Picture narrow cobblestone streets, laundry hanging between buildings, kids playing stickball in the alleys, pushcart vendors selling vegetables and fish, the smell of marinara sauce and fresh bread mixing with the industrial stench from the waterfront. This was a working-class neighborhood, full of people who'd come to America looking for a better life, people who worked in the factories and on the docks, who sent their kids to the public schools and saved every penny they could. And right in the middle of all this life, all this vitality, sat this monstrous tank full of molasses, groaning and creaking in ways that made the neighbors nervous. Because here's the thing, that tank was a disaster waiting to happen, and everyone knew it. The residents had complained for years. They said the tank leaked so badly that neighborhood kids would come with cups and pails to collect the molasses dripping from the seams. They said it made sounds like gunshots on cold nights as the metal contracted and the rivets popped. They said the whole thing swayed when the wind blew hard. But when the neighborhood complained to Purity Distilling Company, they were brushed off. See, these were immigrants. Most of them didn't speak perfect English, and the company didn't take them seriously. The company treasurer, a man named Arthur Gell, actually told investigators later that he thought the neighbors were just trying to collect free molasses. He said the complaints about leaking and groaning were exaggerated. When the tank was first built in 1915, it had been constructed so quickly and so shoddily that it had never been properly tested. The architect who designed it, Arthur Gell himself, had no training in engineering. He'd literally looked at other tanks and guessed at the measurements. No stress tests, no proper inspections, nothing. On January 12, 1919, just 3 days before disaster struck, the Millero, a ship from Puerto Rico, pumped 600,000 gallons of molasses into the tank, filling it nearly to capacity. The molasses was warm when it went in. Molasses was always shipped warm because cold molasses doesn't flow. And that warm molasses hitting the cold Boston winter air created pressure inside that tank like you wouldn't believe. The metal groaned, the rivets strained. Witnesses said they could hear the tank breathing, expanding, and contracting like a living thing. January 15, 1919 started out as a relatively warm day for Boston in January. The temperature had risen to around 45 degrees, unusually mild after days of bitter cold. People were out and about, taking advantage of the weather. Kids were playing in the streets. Workers were on their lunch breaks. The firefighters at Engine 31, which sat right next to the molasses tank, were playing cards and eating their midday meal. A group of city workers was in a municipal building having lunch. Women were shopping, hanging laundry, going about their daily routines. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, people near the tank started to hear a sound. Some described it like machine gun fire, a rapid-fire series of pops as rivets began to fail. Others said it sounded like a freight train bearing down on them. One witness, a teamster named John Barry, looked up from his horse-drawn cart and saw the tank literally splitting apart, the metal tearing like paper. And then, with a roar that could be heard miles away, the tank exploded. 2.5 million gallons of molasses burst forth in a tsunami of brown sludge. The initial wave was 15 feet high in some places, 25 feet high in others. At the epicenter, near the tank itself, the wave may have been as tall as 40 feet, and it was moving fast, 35 miles an hour, some estimates say. Now, you might think, how dangerous can molasses be? It's sticky and slow, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. This molasses was thick as concrete and heavy as wet cement. At that temperature, with that much mass behind it, it hit like a sledgehammer. The wave picked up everything in its path. It lifted a freight train right off its tracks. It tore buildings from their foundations. It snapped steel support beams like they were toothpicks. The firehouse next to the tank, Engine 31, was completely destroyed. The building collapsed, trapping firefighters inside. One fireman, George Leahy, was killed instantly when a piece of the tank came through the wall like a cannonball and crushed him. The other firefighters scrambled to escape, crawling through windows, covered in molasses, bleeding, crying for help. The municipal paving yard was obliterated. The wooden building where the city workers had been eating lunch simply disintegrated. Men were thrown into the molasses, and they couldn't swim through it. It was too thick. They couldn't breathe. The molasses filled their noses and mouths. They couldn't call for help. Some of them just vanished under the surface and were never seen alive again. One of the victims was a city worker named Martin Clougherty. His body wasn't found for 4 days, buried under 6 feet of molasses in what used to be his office. The waves swept toward the harbor, carrying debris, animals, and human beings with it. Horses screamed as they were caught in the flood. That's what survivors remembered most vividly, the sound of horses dying, trapped in molasses up to their necks, unable to move, their eyes wide of terror. One witness, a 10-year-old boy named Anthony DeStasio, was walking home from school when the wave hit. He said the molasses picked him up and threw him like a rag doll. He managed to grab onto something, he never knew what, and hold on until the worst of it passed. He survived, but he was covered in molasses from head to toe, and he had nightmares about it for the rest of his life. The North End became a scene of absolute chaos. People were screaming, crying, calling out for missing loved ones. First responders didn't know where to start. The molasses was everywhere, several feet deep in some places, covering streets, sidewalks, buildings. It was in people's hair, their clothes, their lungs. The smell was overwhelming, sickly sweet, cloying, mixed with the smell of blood and death. And the molasses was still warm, which made it even more horrifying, like the neighborhood had been engulfed by some kind of living, breathing monster. Sailors from a nearby Navy ship, the USS Nantucket, rushed to help. They waded into the molasses, trying to pull people out, but it was like quicksand. The more you struggled, the deeper you sank. Red Cross workers arrived with blankets and medical supplies, but they couldn't get close to the worst areas because the molasses was impassable. Police tried to set up barriers, but people were frantic, searching for family members, and the barriers meant nothing. The rescue effort went on for days. They brought in pumps to clear the molasses, but it was January, and when the temperature dropped at night, the molasses thickened and hardened, making the work even more difficult. Searchers would probe the brown sludge with poles, feeling for bodies. When they found someone, they'd have to dig them out by hand, sometimes using hot water to soften the molasses around them. Some victims were found days later, so coated in molasses that they were unrecognizable. Families had to identify their loved ones by their clothing, by their jewelry, by whatever small details had survived. 21 people died that day. The youngest was a 10-year-old Pasquale Iantosca, who'd been hit by debris while he was out collecting firewood.
The oldest was a 76-year-old teamster named Michael Sinnott. The victims were mostly Italian and Irish immigrants, people who'd come to America dreaming of opportunity and instead found death in the shadow of a negligent company's storage tank. The injured numbered over 150. Some had broken bones, crushed limbs, head injuries from flying debris. Others had inhaled molasses and suffered respiratory damage that would plague them for years. Some of them were permanently disfigured, scarred not just physically, but psychologically. Survivors said they could never escape the smell. For years afterwards, they'd catch a whiff of molasses and be transported back to that awful afternoon, to the screaming and the dying and the helplessness. The cleanup took weeks. They used salt water from the harbor to wash away the molasses, but that just spread it further. The molasses got into the sewers, into the subway system, into people's homes.